This is Financial Standard, the definitive source of news, thought leadership and analysis for Australian wealth management professionals. Financial Standard. Take the lead.
Welcome to the Financial Standard podcast. I'm Riddhi, and today I'm joined by Sheila Kabakungan, Principal Financial Planner and owner of Wealth Forum. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you for having me, Riddhi.
You've built a practice around advising migrant families, drawing on your own story as a first-generation Filipino-Australian. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that started as your focus?
Well, I think that many migrant families, my own included, which is a Filipino-Australian background, look at wealth building and even the role that money plays, not necessarily at an individual level, although individuals are the ones who are kind of creating the income that a family needs, but as family, like from a family perspective. So building wealth, protecting wealth, looking at major spending decisions usually do come under the context of what's good for me and what's good for the family. One of the key cultural differences within the Filipino culture is a word that kind of gets bandied around within my own family context, and that's kapwa. And kapwa, loosely translated, is you within the context of everyone around you and the people that you hold dear. So it's a concept that looks at, well, all right, what's good for you, what's good for everyone else around you or the people that matter most to you. And kapwa drives a lot of the decision-making that happens around where you go to school and how you're educated and where you live, and also ultimately how you're earning money and how you're building and protecting your wealth and the stewardship aspect of all of that. So that really has created some framework around how I approach financial planning, particularly when I deal with families and when I deal with individuals in a family context, which, let's face it, is everyone.
What do mainstream financial services get wrong about advising migrant families? Can you talk a little bit about the blind spots that advisors can face when advising migrant families?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to look at is maybe go down a deeper level around concepts that we think are pretty straightforward. For example, how money is allocated within a budget. One of the things I know about my Filipino culture and heritage is that sometimes you will get people more often than not remitting money back home and, supporting family members or even extended family members all around the world. And that is a cultural dynamic as well. It's not unique to Filipinos, but it is definitely unique to migrant communities, or especially first-generation migrant communities, and not allowing for that in the budget or not even giving importance to that within a financial planning context can create some conflict within the family, or, these ideas of equity and resentment and conflict and inequality, as well as concepts around dependency and who should be a financial dependent and who's not. So it's really pushing up against what we think particularly in my financial planning education, had to then go through that cultural lens to make sure that I could give advice to my community and be culturally sensitive to that. There's even a practical example. I give a lot of advice to SMSF trustees. And I had a trustee once approach me and say they were getting in trouble with their accountant and auditor because their property within their SMSF actually had what the auditor and trustee said was a family member. And I had to unpack that and sort of say, well, why did they think that? And he goes, oh, because my aunt lives there. I go, yeah, but is it a blood-related aunt? Is it, by the definition of related party? Because everyone is an aunt in Filipino culture. And it turns out that no, they just, their professional advisors didn't understand that certain cultures call everyone older than them an aunt or an uncle. And there was no blood or business relationship or even marriage relationship. So they really weren't in trouble. It's just that there was a misinterpretation or a misrepresentation of information going across that could have landed that particular trustee in a bit of bother with the tax office and the regulator. So there's little things like that. So yes, it's definitely the ideas of what is a financial dependent and creating dependency, the whole idea of equality and inequality, even definitions around financial abuse can be challenged by a cultural lens. So being sensitive to that, I think, is one of the things that we have to look at, especially if an advisor wants to deal with a particular migrant community or a community from a different background to the way that we've been educated and trained. I think, too, a large chunk of what's been great about financial planning, particularly in the last 20 years, is we are all looking differently nowadays. So that whole idea of the specific type of advisor being of a certain age, of a specific cultural background, and even of a specific gender has been really challenged. And I think I'm part of that. I'm proud to say I am part of that because you can't be what you can't see. And us being able to work in our communities, but build those bridges between the Australian superannuation system and Australian Centrelink system, and the workforce even, and workplace laws, and the cultural sensitivity that we need to have, and we are a child of two different cultures.
You talked about migrant families supporting relatives overseas through remittance. That's sort of like a cultural thing. How do you actually go about advising clients like that? How do you sort of help them find that line between generosity and clients' own security?
With a lot of conversations, a lot of heart-to-heart conversations, and a lot of unpicking, where is all of that coming from? Is it a sense of obligation, or is it a sense of entitlement and empowerment? And at what point is the family going to collectively decide where boundaries are going to be set? So, for example, is it a bloodline thing, or is it I will look after my siblings, or I will look after my parents? And what does that conversation look like across the entire family dynamic? And it is difficult conversations to have sometimes. I think I play the role of a mediator, or even just someone who can facilitate that conversation at a kitchen table. I talk a lot about with my families that are looking at building wealth together, rules to fight and play fair, because you're going to fight and you also want to play, but you want to do that fairly. And, what does the family value, and how do they rank those values? How does that then come about turning into specific rules on what's going to happen next? And for example, I'm dealing with a lot of families who are, for the first time in this generation, looking at putting their elderly parents into nursing and aged care. And that isn't done in traditional Filipino houses. You look after your old people, and your old people help you look after your young people. But there comes a time, particularly in my own family, where that decision had to be made. I had to help my mother process the guilt and the grief of having to do that to her own mother. But my grandmother's thriving in aged care, run by Filipino aged care specialists who are essentially letting her run the place, and she's healthier, happier, and we're going to guarantee more quality of life because we had to make that culturally different decision to the norm. So sometimes it is about having difficult conversations to challenge the norm. And it even goes to, how do you extend support to other family members, extended family members, without creating this dependency and this entitlement that can happen as well, at the expense of the individual who's, providing that financial support, and at the expense of their own financial well-being. So they are difficult conversations, but they're so worthwhile when you can punch through and create good strategies to support your client and their family.
Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into financial advice? How did you decide that you wanted to do this?
Okay, so I come from a family of first-generation migrants. So they landed after White Australia, and both my parents were accountants. So they came out with a business from America that was running in the Philippines and came to Australia when it relocated. And I grew up here, was educated here, and the last thing I wanted to be was an accountant. So I did a political economy degree, all ready for a career in teaching and education. That's what I thought I was going to do. But I got picked up by a bank graduate program, and I was told they liked me, they liked how I presented an interview, and they basically said, go to the branches and just find something that you want to do, and we just want to support a different type of graduate. So you weren't a finance or accounting or that sort of stuff, but we just like you. And I remember distinctly speaking to a financial advisor in this branch. He handed me a file and he said, I'm going to have you sit in on an interview with a client. Handed me a file and he said, read this like it's a story. So I did. So I read this file like it was a story. It was a story of a young couple who went to see the financial planner as they were getting married and setting themselves up. So he got them insurance, he got them a savings plan for their first home. And I followed this story with the regular meetings that he was doing. And they had children, they had mortgages, they were setting up savings plans. And then something happened. There was a cancer diagnosis that then turned into a income protection claim, followed by a trauma claim. And that was the end of file 1. And I asked for the next file. He gave me the next file and it showed there was a death claim. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I felt this story. And then I said, what's next? Because the death claim was in that second file. Then he handed me a check and he said, you are going to see this lady today. Her children are still in school, but I'm going to present her with this. And he handed me a $500,000 check. And I just sort of sat back and I thought to myself, I want to do this. How do I do this? Because I saw the power of what Louis, the advisor who's no longer with us at the time, said to me, this is what I do every single day. And I said, I want to do this. How do I do this? And back in 1996, the role was, literally a diploma. It was 2 units of a diploma and off you went to become a financial advisor. So 30 years ago, I decided that that's what I wanted to do, and I haven't really looked back.
That's a beautiful story. Did that also, this experience, shape how you wanted to run your own business?
Yes, I did spend, there's two distinct halves to my career. I did spend my time in the banks and also in corporate super, learning
Well,
how to give advice. And I have to credit that. Like, that's exactly what that particular structure taught me. They took risks on us too. Like, for example, they actually gave us the training and the development to then be able to practice and hone our craft and hone our people skills especially, and also how to sell. Because at the end of the day, you are selling and influencing the outcome of your interaction with the client. But I also knew that I was going to come up against that salesy culture that was around at the time. And I went out on my own just as the GFC hit, left corporate super, left that environment, and went to set up in an accounting practice. So set up financial planning in an accounting practice in where I call home, which is Western Sydney. And I was able to actually look after some specific clients that I had in corporate super who used that particular accountant and wanted to continue to work with me, which is fantastic. And I haven't looked back. That was back in 2009. I went self-licensed in 2010 because at the time I really wanted to give the advice that didn't fit into the traditional licensing models, which were very much product focused back then, and been self-licensed ever since. I know that the climate is changing and there's not a year that goes past, usually when the PI insurance comes through and all the levies start to come through, where I don't question the validity of running my own license, because it does take some time to do that. And it also has limited my capacity to grow more, to grow the client base. But these are, for now, questions that I'll probably resolve within the next 5 to 10 years. But I am committed to staying an advisor, a financial advisor, and also doing my part to grow the profession
Yeah.
through what I do as a member-elected director for the Financial Advice Association. I love doing my advocacy work. I love getting out into the schools and into the TAFEs and universities and talking about financial capability and careers in financial advice. Love all of that. And I also love doing my podcast, which is my love letter to my community, which is out in Western Sydney.
I'm very glad you joined us on our podcast as well. One of the core propositions of Wealth Forum is that clients can trust your advice is not influenced by any financial institution. Tell us more about that. You talked about self-licensing. Tell us more about why this independence matters so much to you.
Well, I think what we've got to look at is fear and favour are probably the two terms I look at. So is my advice able to stand against the fear and favour that could influence the decision-making or the advice process that I run? And not to say that, being in a large licensee, it doesn't allow for that fear and favour to be away from that fear and favour. But from my perspective at the time when I was looking at licensing, I still felt like I was tied to product or process or a specific way of running the practice, which didn't align with what I wanted to do and how I wanted to serve my clients and the types of services that I wanted to provide for them. I do focus on small business owners and their families out in Western Sydney. And what I love to do is build advisory benches for them, build advisory teams for them that will involve me working collegiately, if not collaboratively, with the rest of their money team. So their mortgage broker or their commercial broker, the two types of lawyers that should enter their life around financials, around commercial, but also financial, family services and personal services. So estate and succession lawyers as well as family lawyers, and their debt team. So who are they using for their debt? Do they have a personal banker? So I like to get to know what that team looks like. And if the client needs to, I'll build a team around them. And that's probably the way that I like to work. And making sure that the professions that I align with all know their own lanes and their specialties, and we're all willing to work together. We're not trying to cut each other's cloth or or one up each other against our client. That's the sort of stuff that I like to do. And it didn't fit the mold at the time. I do know that it probably will be something that will have to be challenged into the future. But I see a lot of those examples now where practices become all finance to maybe serve a particular type of client. So a family office model or, looking after business owners and things like that.
As a self-licensed business, compliance, I would assume, like you said, is something that can take a lot of your time. Can you tell us practically how does that look like in a week? How much time does compliance take, and how much time are you actually able to take out in terms of advising clients? How do you go about managing that?
Well, I think good compliance, whether you are self-licensed or an authorised representative of a licensee, has to start with what are your operations and your daily interactions doing to ensure that you're compliant. I do have external licensee services and support, that I've always had. If anything, to help me cut through the noise and to edit down to what's relevant for me and what's relevant for my practice. I've purposefully kept everything small, so I am single. I am the only advisor in my licensee that's practicing as an advisor, and I do have a locum and a backup plan as well, who is another authorised rep who's chosen to focus more on a different career path, but is maintaining her qualifications and working through me. So I've got the succession down. But from a day-to-day perspective, it's really no different to, it is a bit different, but you are still running an advice business. And then you've got the compliance layer over and above that in terms of being a responsible manager and a licensee. But what I've managed to do is align myself with really, really clean processes and a licensee services provider who provides me with a lot of that content, a lot of that framework to cut through the noise. So it's still it's fully compliant, but from that perspective of it is me, self-licensed, running my own show and ensuring that I'm compliant, first of all, with what I've got to do to make sure that I can stay in business and stay advising.
Where do you think all of this is headed? I know you said that you'll sort of visit this in the next 5 to 10 years, but as someone who's in the business and sort of dealing with the reality of being a self-licensed advisor, where do you think is the future a home for advisors? Would it be independent like you are or pulled together in more consolidated groups? Where do you think it's headed, the industry?
I think we're headed towards the larger licensees actually taking on more and more authorised reps. So whether they are growing them internally through succession strategies that they're employing, or they're going to continue to consolidate and start buying up some more of the smaller practices as they look for their own succession strategies. I definitely think that the industry funds or the super funds will definitely get back into the space in a much more real way. And I would love for them to do that because we have a massive advice gap, as you would know, Riti. We have a massive advice gap. And, my work with the Financial Advice Association shows me that, the average age of the financial planner is over 50, right? So we're in our last maybe 20 years of productive capacity to be able to give advice. And some of us may work longer than that. But where are our succession strategies going to come from? They're going to come from growing organically, which basically means we need a bunch of new entrants to come through, whether they're here in Australia or we're starting to look at pathways to bring people in from overseas who are already working in our advice practices. And whether or not we actually start to open those doors again to other groups of career changes or different ways to provide advice to clients. When they need it, it might be episodic, it might be full service, but I think there's going to be some changes to how advice is run in the country. I'd love to see the industry funds and the super funds getting back into the space in a real way and providing that intra-fund advice, but also knowing that they should and can refer outside to the specialised advice areas, particularly when it's dealing with self-managed super funds or intergenerational wealth or aged care or even life insurance. We definitely need to get back into life insurance in this country as well. We have very few risk advisors left who are pure risk advisors. So I'm all for reskilling myself as well into getting back into life insurance as a standalone rather than as a bolt-on as part of a holistic advice package. I think episodic advice and scoping advice is going to be very important as well. So not everyone wants or needs a full financial plan.
Just one last question. You talk about the 3 things you want to deliver for every client: hope, peace, and a sense of plenty. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think hope is one of those things that you can't manufacture hope. It's actually got to be created through what you set out to create, and you can't fake hope either. It's either there or it's not. So it's creating the space for hope to spring up. Peace, I think, is a relative concept, but not to be kept awake at night over money. And sometimes it's not even about the lack of it. Sometimes it's the presence of it and not knowing how to make the most of it, particularly when you're dealing with a family context as well or a cultural context around my Filipino community. The decisions made around, for example, when and if do we sell the family home? What do we do with assets overseas? How do I ensure that I'm not creating an entitled next generation who at the expense of my own financial well-being? At what point can we take a risk to enable, the establishment of a business or taking on a different type of investment? All of those sorts of things come about through discussions and strategy, and then you can actually live with the consequences of it. And that's where the peace comes in. I think peace is one of those things that will be. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not without worry. It just means that you have the ability, the agility, and the capacity to be able to make decisions in an aligned way to how you want to live your life, but also with the agency to know that you can change your mind and move around with whatever your life brings to you next. And plenty, everyone's enough is different. And I spend a lot of time getting my clients to quantify what is enough for them and really testing that and really pushing in on what they're saying versus what I can actually see them doing when we do the forensic work on their budgets and, and how they've spent their money. Or if there are questions that are coming up around a particular investment strategy that don't necessarily align with their behaviour, I will question what plenty looks like because it is a movable feast. And once we quantify plenty and once we quantify enough, it just becomes so much easier to plan and to have that conversation and to implement the investment and insurance strategies that go along the way.
That was a great conversation. Thank you, Sheila, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Financial Standard podcast. For more information, visit financialstandard.com.au. Please keep in mind that the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature and does not consider personal circumstances. Reliance should not be placed on any content without further independent financial research and advice.